Ladies, gentlemen, and tarnished of all ages, the time is nearly upon us to breach the cocoon into the realm of Shadow. And before we dive into this, there will be footage of Shadow of the Erdtree gameplay in this video, both from the very beginning open world section and a very specific cutoff dungeon unrelated to the main story, so nothing major by any means, but spoiler warning nonetheless for those who want to stay as blind as possible. That said, with the DLC coming up so unbelievably soon, and especially with this new gameplay being shared with us recently at the Red Bull Live event, specifically with it being directly in player hands, they got to look at the systems and the inventories in more detail than we've been shown up to this point really, and all of it just gives us a lot more information about the DLC coming up, which of course helps us know quite simply how to have a smoother time and what types of mistakes that we can avoid making early just by knowing the information beforehand. Without further ado then, if you are here, you probably already have made up your mind on this one, but don't be afraid to look up guides about Shadow of the Erdtree. Simultaneously, don't feel pressured to do so either. Elden Ring is a vast game full of exploration and side quest threads that you can easily miss, and Shadow of the Erdtree is going to be similarly formatted, just on a different scale. There will be weapons or NPCs or items or armor or interactions that you can just easily walk past, but that's okay. There's no shame in missing something the first time you go through an area within any of the games in this series. That said, I know a lot of people like to just know where things are. They like to hear where a cool weapon is and then just go instantly grab it, and you should know that Miyazaki himself has said that while they don't design the game around guides by any means, in fact they view it as a failure if people need guides, they do view it as a totally valid way of playing the game if you want to use them. And if the creator of the game isn't throwing shade at you for using guides, then you shouldn't feel pressured one way or the other in the slightest. That said, when you start the DLC, somewhat like with the base game of Elden Ring, you will be plopped down at a sort of entrance to a large, sprawling open world. There will be visible landmarks in the distance in every direction, and as From Software games are generally known for, if you can see something impressive looking in the distance, you can get there physically. That said, following the impressive structures immediately is essentially asking to be thrown into the frying pan immediately after leaving the fire that he lands between. Like with the base game, there is significant difficulty variance in the DLC between different parts of it, different areas, different enemy types, and of course we are going to have full-on remembrance bosses and such like that too along a specific path as well. Point being, for those who haven't had a proper Elden Ring playthrough in a while, remember that you aren't locked to a single path. If you try something and you find it too hard, you don't have to keep shoving your face into the wall until either the enemy dies or you pass out from exhaustion. You can always just choose to leave, go do something else, find a new weapon, gain some sort of other power, and then come back. Part of the beauty of Elden Ring and its DLC too is how non-linear it is, so just don't let that concept go to waste. On a similar note to that, there are specific items that you will either want to specifically look out for, or not I suppose, depending on what type of player you are, which are scadutree fragments and revered spirit ashes. These are our two new permanent upgrade items in Shadow of the Erdtree. Think of them sort of like golden seeds and sacred tears from the base game, which you collected to slowly increase your number of flasks and the amount of resource gained when consuming a flask. Further upgrades to these required more of the items for each upgrade, and there was a limit to them before you reached sort of maximum power. The difference is that scadutree fragments increase not only your damage dealt, but also your damage negation, specifically in the Shadow of the Erdtree zones. So a straight up offense and defense increase all in one, locked specifically to the DLC. And the revered spirit ashes buff your spirit summons, and also interestingly, torrents, damage negation specifically, your mount. These mechanics essentially exist to make the idea of player level less important, to punish people less who played more or less of the base game before entering the DLC, because these items only actually affect your character in the DLC areas, and the DLC is balanced around their existence. That said, they are permanent when used and require exploration to find, and they essentially act as your own personal difficulty slider for each individual player. The mistake to avoid here then can actually go both ways. If you are someone who really prizes the challenge of these games, you don't want to use one of these every time you pick one up. You want to collect them and use them if you see it fit, if you think it's necessary, if you think it's the right choice for you. Alternatively, again, sort of like the previous section, don't be afraid to use them either if you're really struggling with something. They exist for a reason, and one of the main things that you'll be able to do if you are struggling with a boss is just go out for a ride, look for some more scadutree fragments to buff yourself up real quick. On which note, I do want to talk about the sort of try-hard, elitist, get-good mindset, and to put it very plainly, I don't think there is anything wrong with relishing the challenge of the game. In fact, I think there is a ton of satisfaction to be gained from the challenge challenge, and I think adding on self-imposed challenges like not using weapons that are considered too powerful, or avoiding magic, or avoiding summons is perfectly fine, especially if you enjoy the game more when you play it that way. But the mistake here is for the average player who sees people saying things like, oh, summons are cheating, and then gets extremely self-conscious about ever using a summon, struggles like hell against a boss, and then has a bad time with the game as a result. There is nothing wrong with actively choosing to make the game more challenging for yourself, but don't force others to do the same to themselves. And if you are someone who is struggling at any point, you should absolutely not feel bad for using summons or overpowered weapons or whatever really. If it's in the game, it's fair game. Simple as that. Speaking of which, don't get locked in your original playstyle. Just because you boot up the game into your old save and find yourself in a specific stat layout or using a specific weapon or magic setup doesn't mean that you are stuck with it forever. And even if you are someone who has a particular love of a base game weapon and you think you want to use it through the whole DLC, don't be so rigid. There are tons of new playstyles that will be available in this expansion, some of which are genuinely just so unique to Shadow of the Erdtree and extremely exciting to me, such as dueling shields. I mean, come on, give me a goddamn pointy great shield, bring back my giant door of greatness. That to say, just stay open-minded. The DLC will offer new playstyles if you choose to accept them, but it will also ask new things of you gameplay-wise, either through new kinds of puzzles you'll have to interpret, or new types of attacks from enemies that you need to deal with in possibly unexpected ways. Don't be locked to how you played the base game, be open and adaptable. Past that, and somewhat related, don't worry too much about your actual character stats. Of course, stats matter, level matters, and having the right stats is how you reach peak power, but most of the power of a weapon comes from the upgrades it has received, and just the base stats of the weapon itself really. And importantly, in Shadow of the Erdtree, scadutree fragments are the main way of scaling the difficulty of the entire experience. So the difference between having okay stats and having great stats, especially in the expansion, will be noticeable, sure, and it is important, but don't let that stop you from trying out a new weapon type that you find just because it doesn't match your current stat line with its scaling. I mean, again, even in the recent Red Bull Live event, when 10 players, a number of which being Elden Ring speedrunners, were given a character to progress on, pretty much every single one of them spent about 3 minutes at the start just shifting through the various weapons in their inventory, checking out the moveset, seeing what felt good to play, because comfort and enjoyment matter more than numbers any day of the week in a game like this. That said, of course, once you decide if you really like a weapon, there are always things like larval tiers that you can use to respec your stats anyways. Then this next one is very, very directly related to the recent gameplay we had at the Red Bull Live event, because at the end of the area players were given access to, there was of course a boss. Skip to the timestamp on screen if you want to remain fully unboss spoiled, but this boss had a particular mechanic which is simply invisibility. The ability of the players to deal with this seemed pretty inconsistent. Sometimes they just swung wildly and happened to hit and it worked. Sometimes the boss would be visible for long periods, sometimes it wouldn't be, but the functional mechanic here was an invisible boss, and there is a very direct counter to this concept available in the base game already that we can bring with us to deal with this anywhere it happens to pop up in the DLC, especially now that we know for sure that it will, and that is the Sentry's Torch item. The fun part, it's super easy to go out and grab this right now if you don't have it. Just go to the Hermit Merchant Shack just outside of Lane Dell in the inner Altus Plateau area, and he'll be more than willing to sell it to you for a chunk of runes. Then this next one is a bit of a meta tip, but don't miss out on the actual release time of the DLC. If you are on console, for the most part the DLC will release at midnight in the time zone of your store's region, with the exception of Pacific and Central time zones, which both get it at Eastern time zone midnight. However, it gets a lot more interesting if you are playing on PC, as the DLC will be released in all time zones simultaneously on Steam, and well, for most people that still results in a June 21st release date in some way, shape, or form as expected. Specifically, this means for a lot of people in North and South America, it will be released a number of hours earlier than you might be expecting, with the Pacific time zone getting the most generous bonus of releasing at 3 p.m. on the 20th. Point being, very simply, check your release time, because you may accidentally be starting a whole day late if you're in the Americas and you aren't aware of this. Ninth up then, this is a pretty big one, which is Baldachin's Blessing. This is a long-standing gacha moment from the base game, which is players realizing there is a permanent debuff that you can get if you choose to share a hug with Fia in the roundtable hold on your bed. Nearly every player will do this at least once in their first playthrough, because it's an NPC interaction in a FromSoft title, which means that you do it, and it immediately will give you a debuff that causes you to have 5% lower maximum health. And I bet you the majority of players coming back for this DLC, especially the ones who stopped playing a month or two after the base game release, probably don't even know that this is still affecting their main character to this day. Put simply, if you have this down arrow in a red square under your stamina bar, then you have this debuff. Thankfully, getting rid of it is actually pretty simple. You just need to go to your inventory and find the Baldachin's Blessing item that is in there and use it. Then when you reset it to Grace, you'll get your 5% maximum health back. Then finally, this one is of the utmost importance, but also one that we have talked about before, so I don't really want to overly harp on it, but in order to actually access and play Shadow of the Erdtree on release, there are 3 requirements and nothing else. First, you have to buy the DLC, but that's sort of a given. The other 2, though, are specific demigod bosses that you have to have dead on your save. The one pretty much everyone knows they have to kill is, of course, Moog, which is obvious to most people given the cocoon is in the arena and that's our entry point to the DLC, but what is far less obvious, based on the surprise that I continually see from people every time it is brought up, is that you also have to have killed Radahn in Caelid. The exact story reason for this we don't know for sure yet, but logically it implies that some of the events in Shadow of the Erdtree will be related to the stars no longer being stopped by Radahn's presence and magic, which is quite interesting. And that said, that's about everything for today then, everyone. 10 mistakes to avoid making for Shadow of the Erdtree, heavily influenced by recently released gameplay. Everything from tips for how to prepare mentally to just general gameplay advice. And remember, more so than any other FromSoft game in the past, this DLC's scadutree fragments are essentially a personal difficulty slider. Don't feel bad for using them, and don't feel forced to use them either. It's your game, your experience, and your enjoyment, so that is what matters above all else. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.